Welcome everybody to Scoundrels, Rascals, and Cutthroats and the Scottsdale Lawmen that caught them. My name is Bruce Wall and I'll be your tour guide through 5 famous cases of crimes in Scottsdale. I have to channel my brother for a second. The following program contains matter that may be inappropriate for younger viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. I'd like to dedicate this to the men and women of the Scottsdale Police Department and all the first responders. Some of you know that I used to work for the Scottsdale Police Department and I used to respond to emergencies. And it wasn't until after I left the police department and started working in my current department, Citizen Service, that I found out what it's like to have the 911 called for me. Now I've had to have it twice. And I've realized all the more how incredible is the men and women of the Scottsdale Police Department, Fire Department, our emergency room nurses and doctors who help us all at the worst moment in our lives is just another day at the office to them. So that's why I'd like to dedicate it to all of them. Let's start off with a crazy story of Popcorn John. Now please notice something right off the bat. This is not called the logical story of Popcorn John. This is not called the it makes sense story of Popcorn John. This is called the crazy story of Popcorn John, because when we get to the end, you're going to say, that didn't make any sense. That's right. So why was he called Popcorn John? Popcorn John was about 5'3". He weighed about 130 pounds. He had bad teeth. He walked with a stoop. And he was the mail carrier who delivered the mail from Phoenix to Scottsdale. And on the weekends, to make a little bit extra money, especially on Sunday, people would go to the courthouse in Phoenix and walk around, go for strolls. He would sell popcorn on the courthouse steps and make some extra money. And he got the nickname of Popcorn John. His neighbors called him Crazy John, because what he would do is if a dog or cat came onto his property, he would shoot it or poison it. And when people would confront him about it, he just showed no emotion. He just seemed to look at them and say, okay, and he'd go back into his house. It was such a strange thing that they called him Crazy John for that. So that's why I've sort of hybrided into the crazy story of Popcorn John. In 1901, law enforcement for Scottsdale was done by the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. And at that time, the man's name was Sam Stout, and the Stout family has a long political career in Glendale. Now, we know what Scottsdale looks like today. Let me show you a couple things to point out. We see this is Scottsdale Road from south to north. This is Indian School Road from east to west. This is the Chase Bank on the corner. That's a drive-through. Those two buildings, you'll see in a second what they look like back in the day. This is the Sugar Bowl. And you see this is Main Street. And this building right here is called Bischoff's Shades of the West. But in 1901, that was the general store, and we'll see that in just a second. And just for your knowledge, this got built right over here. I think it's here. That's the Little Red Schoolhouse, just down the street from where we are right now. So now look at what it looks like today. And the area we're going to be talking about is right here, 4141 North Scottsdale Road, on the bottom left of the screen. And now we're going to do some time traveling. That's a picture of what it looked like in sometime around 1900, 1901. Now you see this building right here. That's where the Chase Bank is now. This is where the drive-through is now. These buildings that are here, that's where the Sugar Bowl is now, but those aren't buildings, those are tents. And somewhere back here, we can't quite see it because this tree's in the way, is the general store. And right here is the area that we're talking about where the crazy story of Popcorn John took place. So for a long time, I tried to figure out how did they take this picture? In 1901, there were no airplanes. This is not an aerial photograph. There's certainly no Google Maps in 1900. So the nearest thing that I can tell was from this vantage point, you would have seen that. If you turned around and looked, you'd see the Underhill house. Howard and Ida Underhill owned this house, and Howard was a sickly man and he couldn't do farm work, so he set up the house as a bed and breakfast. So in effect, this was Scottsdale's first hotel. And it was on the northwest corner of Indian School and Scottsdale Road. And my guess is they went up to the top and to the roof, set up a tripod, and shot that picture. The people's property where this all happened at are Helen and Winfield Scott. This is the famous picture of them. Helen is on Winfield Scott's old army mule, Old Maud, and they made a statue of this in front of the little red schoolhouse. It's by Georgianne Tagnani. Winfield Scott purchased his land in 1888. He owned from Indian School to Chaparral, from Scottsdale to Hayden, 640 acres, and he paid $2.50 an acre. That was such a great deal that he made a good fortune off it from the sale of the land later on, and his wife sold some of the land off after Winfield had died. He was a Baptist minister. He was a Civil War veteran. He fought for the Union. And he was this charismatic speaker that wherever he went and spoke, people would come and see him present. He could fill up any church if they knew that Winfield Scott was going to be there. And then the next week, when the regular minister would be there, it would be empty. But he purchased the land, and when you hear the name Scottsdale, he's the Scott of Scottsdale. So Popcorn John used to ride his wagon from Phoenix to Scottsdale to deliver the mail, and on May 6, 1901, every day that he delivered the mail, he would stop at Winfield Scott's house, and he would eat his lunch under a shaded tree. And on this particular day, he got in a little bit early, and he started eating a little bit early. And Winfield Scott had broken his leg, and he had needed some extra help, so he had brought in his usual 2 helpers, and he asked for a 3rd helper because he essentially couldn't do anything to help them. I've tried to explain this story so many times. This was my first effort. I drew this out, and then I gave it to our digital media artists and said, make this a story, and then I would tell the story, and half the audience would go, oh, that's really cool. And the other half would say, I don't get what you're talking about. So I went back to our digital media specialist and I said, let's try something new. Let's see if you and I can work together to animate it. So here's the new story of Popcorn John. Popcorn John arrived, and he left his horse and mail wagon in the paddock of Winfield Scott's, and he went over to eat. As you see, there he is under the tree. He's eating his lunch. This is about 10:30, and Winfield Scott's helpers come into the paddock area, and something happened. You saw that little skip on the horse? Well, the bridle or something came off the horse, and he couldn't figure out how to get it back on. The guy who was on the wagon, so he asked for help from another guy. And let me explain all these people. Oh, here's John Rubenstein sees what's going on, and he wants to see if he can get his mail wagon out. So here is, up at the top is Peter Johnson. He's a Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community member. He's been working for Winfield Scott on May 6th for 2 weeks. Amos Nye is the man holding the horse, and he's trying to get it. He's worked for Winfield Scott for about 7 or 8 years. And his brother started off working for Winfield Scott, and now he's a farmer in the area. Werner Vanderhoof is the man that's on the wagon trying to get this bridle going back on. And then John Rubenstein walks in, and here's the crazy story. Remember what I told you, it's the crazy story. And I've only taken liberties with one part of the story, and I'll show you where it is. So Rubenstein walks on over first to Amos Nye. And he says to Amos Nye, you're my friend, aren't you, Amos? And Amos says, oh, yes. So he turns and he walks away over to Peter Johnson. And Peter Johnson is watching some other guys are hunters in the area, and they're shooting for some rabbits, and he thinks they might be drunk or something. So he's keeping their eyes on him. He doesn't view Popcorn John as any sort of threat. So Popcorn John pulls out his gun, shoots him, and he dies. Completely unprovoked. He then walks over to Amos Nye. Amos Nye whips around and looks at him like, what are you doing? He doesn't say anything. He just stares at him, and Popcorn John shoots him. He doesn't die quite right away, and Helen Scott hears the sound. Here she is over at the house, and she comes running over. Now, here's the part where I took a license. She probably climbed through the fencing, but I couldn't figure out how to do that, so I have her jumping over like this. So she jumped over, and as she runs over to see what's going on, John Rubenstein casually walks over to his mail truck, and she says, "What happened, Amos?" And he says, "I've been shot." And she says, "Who shot you?" And he says, "He," indicating John Rubenstein. And Rubenstein now somehow can find his way to get out of the area. So we have two victims, Peter Johnson and Amos Nye. Werner Vanderhoof is the witness, and his account was given to Amos Nye's obituary in the newspaper, essentially had this account, a witness of Werner Vanderhoof and Helen Scott. There's a picture that I believe is Peter Johnson. I haven't been able to verify it, but he's about the right age. He lived at Salt River, Pima, Maricopa Indian community. There's a picture of Werner Vanderhoof as a younger man. And I was able to find a picture, of course, of Helen Scott, but I was not able to find a picture of Amos Nye. It seems to have been lost to history. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I went on a search for Popcorn John's photo. So Popcorn John rides his mail wagon over to the general store. It's owned by J.L. Davis, and this is the part that today's Bishop's Shade of the West. He leaves the gun on the seat, and he goes in to deliver the mail. He's not out of breath. He's not nervous. It's as if nothing has happened. He delivers the mail to J.L. Davis. They talk for a second. He goes back to the wagon, and he sees his gun's gone, and he thinks that's strange, and he takes his wagon back. Well, the man who took the gun off the wagon to try and disarm him tells J.L. Davis, and J.L. Davis sort of takes control at this point. And he tells a man named Parham to run over to the Crosscut Canal where there's a phone and call the Maricopa County Sheriff. And he and his son go off in hot pursuit in their wagon. Well, they never caught him. There's a picture of J.L. Davis. So they call for Sheriff Stout to send someone to arrest him, and he sends Deputy Williams. There's no other information on him but Deputy Williams. They never give a first name. They never give an initial. So it's been hard to figure out exactly who he was or try and find a picture of Deputy Williams. But when Deputy Williams confronts Popcorn John, he says, "Why did you do that?" And he says, "That's the way I fix them when they try and get me." And he says, "No one was trying to get you." And he says, "Well, they were interfering with the delivery of the U.S. mail." And that was his defense in court. When he went to court, Judge Street found him guilty by reason of insanity. Said that nobody could do what he did as a logical, sane, rational person. Now, at this point, I started to go on this search for a picture of John Rubenstein. The first thing I did was I contacted Richard Howley of the library. He's our archivist. And I said, of the Scottsdale Heritage Connection, I said, "Do you have any pictures of Popcorn John?" He said, "Sorry, Bruce, I don't." So I went to the Scottsdale Historical Society. I said, "Do you guys have any pictures?" They said, "He's a crazy guy. He killed people. Why would we keep pictures of him?" Darn. So I contacted the Phoenix Historical Society. And they said, essentially, he might have been a big deal in Scottsdale for being the first murderer, but he's nothing in Phoenix. We don't have any pictures of him. So then I got this brilliant idea, and I called the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office Records Department. And I said, could I get a picture of Popcorn John Rubenstein? He was arrested by Deputy Williams in 1901. And then there was a pause. And then the lady said, "Could you repeat that?" So I did. And then she covered the phone, but I could hear her say, "Helen, this guy thinks we keep pictures from 1901. And I can hear them laughing. And then she takes off the thing off the phone and says, "I'm sorry, sir, we don't have those photos." I said, "Thank you very much." So I'm thinking, how could I find this? I read the article again, and suddenly the light bulb went off on my head. He got sentenced to the Yuma Territorial Prison. That was the prison of the Arizona Territory at that time. This is 1901. Arizona didn't become a state until 1912, on February 14th. So I look up online for the Yuma Territorial Prison, And there's a thing called the Friends of the Yuma Territorial Prison. So I sent them an email on Friday. And I thought, well, let's see, what do I have to lose? And on Monday, I find out that my email to the Friends of the Yuma Territorial Prison got forwarded to the manager of the prison museum, who replied to me and said, here are 2 photographs of Popcorn John Rubenstein. Now, that's his prisoner number, 1814. That's not the year. It was 1901. And you see this object in his pocket right there. I think that was a comb sticking up, because I think that's probably the closest thing he had to combed hair. And he sent me one other item, and it was like the treasure trove of this whole thing. His prisoner record. And that's how I knew his age, his height. He walked with a stoop. He had bad teeth. That's how I had all this information from this. And if you look at it with today's eyes, there's a statement in this prison record that just makes you sort of shake your head and say, they did what? Let me zoom in. So first off, he gets sentenced in 1901. Yuma Territorial Prison closes in 1909. And then all the prisoners are transferred to Florence Territorial Prison until it becomes Florence State Prison, which it is today. But if you look in there, there's a line that says, sent on his honor as a convicted murderer, to work on the state highway in Globe on July 29, 1912. Now that's amazing, but the next line is even wackier. He came back. It says return from Globe on 6 months later on June 15, 1913, because the camp was closed. The guy had honor. He served until 1915, when the first governor of Arizona first commuted his sentence from life in prison to 25 years, and then he paroled him. He died approximately 2 years later, and I've not been able to figure out where. I know the date, it's on this prisoner record, of when he died. It just doesn't say where he died. Now I have to go off on a planned tangent. Little interesting story about the Yuma Territorial Prison. In 1909, it closes. Yuma High School is opened in 1909, but it burns to the ground in 1910. Where are we going to put the students? I know, let's put them in the prison. For 3 years, Yuma High School was operated from the territorial prison until the town of Yuma said, we want the prison for a city jail. And they built them a high school and they moved everybody. After this, whenever the Yuma High School would go competing in different sporting events, the other teams would sort of jokingly refer to them as the Crims, as in criminals. Now, you'd normally think that a high school might be offended by this. Not Yuma High School. They embraced it. And to this day, they are now known as the Yuma High School Criminals. This is their crest. Notice the ball and chain. I love that. And notice the criminal guy up in the top left corner. I've actually worked with some people who are alumni from Yuma High School, and they proudly tell you that they're a criminal. Winfield Scott had a couple problems with this thing, but one of his biggest problems was Peter Johnson, the member of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, who was shot. Because unfortunately, this was Winfield Scott's biggest neighbor. The town of Scottsdale at this time is 75 people, so there's way more people. He has to have good relations. He goes out and preaches at different times at the reservation, so he wants to make sure that the chief knows that this had nothing to do with someone in Scottsdale. This is this crazy person. And Peter Johnson was working for him. So he asked his friend, Judson Elliott, who's another minister, and they load up Peter Johnson's body on a wagon, and they go out to meet the chief, and they explain that there was no one in Scottsdale involved. It was this crazy guy from Phoenix, Popcorn John. There's also 2 conclusions about this case. The first one came from my former commander of the downtown district of the Scottsdale Police Department, who said to me, after I told him the story, he said, driving in Old Town's been a problem ever since. And the second great conclusion came not from me, but our state historian, Marshall Trimble, who said the term going postal has Scottsdale roots. We're going to turn the page of that part of history and go a little bit into the future, into 1954. But before we hit 54, let's stop with a speed bump On June 21st, 1951, the town of Scottsdale is incorporated as a town, population 2,032. So we're bigger than 75. The areas that you see here in red are land that became annexed into Scottsdale in the 50s, and the land in blue was annexed in the 60s. Law enforcement was provided by a combination of the Scottsdale Marshal's Office at the time of incorporation. They had a marshal's office, and they hired the first town marshal, Hurley Pruitt. And he handled all misdemeanors, and the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office handled felonies. In this story, the area around Scottsdale and Camelback is a particular note. So I put this aerial photograph from 1954 so you can see essentially what Scottsdale looked like. Notice what we don't see around here. We don't see a baseball stadium. We don't see a hospital. We don't see City Hall where we are sitting right now. These are all in Scottsdale's future. But you see this area in the black circle, that's Scottsdale and Camelback, and where the Arizona Canal goes through Scottsdale and Camelback. And this area right here in the red circle, that's Schumann Lane. We're going to talk a little bit about Schumann Lane in this case. The victim is Vernon Don Frederick. He's known as Jim Frederick. Here's a picture of him with his family. His father is behind him, and his mother, Ivy, is in the right part of the picture. So again, Al was hired as the town marshal in 1922, and there's Jim. His father died in 1950 in office, and his mom had to take over as, not marshal. Al Frederick was the constable. So here he is. He dies in office in 1950, and his wife has to take over until Scottsdale incorporates. So you think, oh my gosh, 1950, that must be Arizona's first female law enforcement if his mom was the constable of Scottsdale. Well, let's take a look. Let's go on a planned tangent. He dies in May. He's not the first. The first one was actually Maricopa County Sheriff in 1944. He was a 3-term sheriff. He died in 44 while in office in February, and his wife, Jewel, became the Maricopa County Sheriff. And to this day, she's the only female Maricopa County Sheriff that we've ever had. After she was the sheriff, the next sheriff appointed her in charge of crime prevention. Then she became a county auditor, a county treasurer, and then she became the state auditor for a number of terms. So she was the first female law enforcement officer in the state of Arizona. Constable Alan Macon died in office just a few months before Al Fredericks. So his wife took over, so she became the second female law enforcement officer. And that makes Ivy Fredericks, and here's a picture from the Arizona Republic. It says, Ivy Fredericks' word is law in the western town of Scottsdale. That makes her the third female law enforcement officer in the state of Arizona's history. Now let's get back to our victim, Jim Fredericks. He graduated from Arizona State Teachers College in 1939. He was not there to become a teacher. He took classes to become an accountant. And notice he's rocking a pompadour haircut before Elvis Presley. Arizona Teachers College was originally called Tempe Normal School. After it was called Arizona Teachers College, it was called Arizona State College, and then finally it became Arizona State University in Tempe. He works for a year as an accountant and bookkeeper for different businesses. He opens his own business, and then he gets appointed to the town council of Scottsdale in about 1952. And then he gets elected after that. And this is a picture of his first business, V.D. Frederick's Chevron gas station. And around 1948, Malcolm White, who would become the mayor of Scottsdale, got the Chamber of Commerce to adopt the slogan, the Westmost Western Town, and they encouraged everyone to change their business to look Western. So this is what Jim Fredericks did. He turned into Jim Fredericks Auto Livery Stable. I guess the idea is your car is your horse, and instead of feeding it hay, you feed it gas or what? I don't. That was the idea. It was to try and make it look more Western. Dorotha and Jim Fredericks lived next door to Fay and William Demand. And they lived on Schumann Lane. Here's Camelback Road. Here's the Arizona Canal. Here's Schumann Lane. The Fredericks lived down here in the corner, and the Demands lived right next door to them. And you can see the Demands have a nice pool. So let me tell you a little bit about what happened this night. On Tuesday, July 27, 1954, the Demands and the Fredericks had drinks together, and everyone will agree to this. But what happened after that is totally up to who you talk to, because William Demand was arrested for first-degree murder of Jim Fredericks after this night. Let me tell you the story. So here's the 4 people that we have, and it's kind of confusing, so I have this one animated as well. So first off, we have Dorotha and Jim Fredericks on the left side. Dorotha was about 6 years younger than Jim. Dorotha was originally a Hamer, and if that name means anything to anyone, probably not. Just we all aren't old enough. The Hamers opened up the very first restaurant that had a liquor license in Scottsdale in 1934, right after Prohibition was repealed. And then they ran it for 10 or 15 years, then they sold it, and Malcolm White, the first mayor, but before he was mayor, bought it, and he opened up as White's Cafe. Then it burned to the ground, so he moved it to a new location, called it White's Restaurant. Then he decided to lease it to somebody else who opened a restaurant, then changed to another restaurant, and the second restaurant that it changed to, the Pink Pony. The Pink Pony moved to the location we all think of today, and it ended business in 2015. So the Hamers are a chain all the way to the Pink Pony. So that was Dorotha's family. And then their next door neighbors, Fay Demand over here. Fay was a Texas oil heiress, and this was her second marriage, and she had a son that was about 9 years old and who was away to summer camp. And because her family was so wealthy, they gave her an annuity that was so much money. She made more money in 1 month than most people in Scottsdale made in a year. She had the newest and finest of everything. She bought a Cadillac every year, brand new. And 1953 was the year that 1 million window air conditioners were sold around the country. I'm sure she owned at least one because she could afford whatever she wanted. And Bill Demand owned the photography store in town called Scottsdale Photography. And because we're recording this, I'll say this for posterity. Before cell phones, you used to have to buy a camera and put film into it. And when you were done taking your pictures, there was 12, 24, or 36 exposures. You took the film out and you took it to a photography store who would develop it for you and put it on paper and charge you money for it. And he ran the photography store in town. He also, if he ever heard a fire engine or an ambulance, he'd go running after it and he'd take pictures and he'd sell it as a freelance photographer. So in this first version of the story, it's called The Jealous Husband, and it stars William or Bill Demand. So in this, they have drinks, and something happens, and Bill figures out that Fay and Jim are having an affair. So he decides that he's going to confront Jim about this. And just to be sure, he grabs, Fay's from Texas, she has a lot of guns, so he grabs one of the guns and takes it with him, and he goes marching over next door. And when he gets there, he says, "Jim, you're having an affair with my wife, and you're going to stop it right now." And Jim says, "No, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." And Bill says, "Oh yes, I've got Fay's gun, and I can kill you." And Jim says, "You wouldn't dare." By the way, I'm making this all up. We don't know what they said. But this is what I'd like to believe that happened. So he says, "You wouldn't dare," so he shoots him, and he's dead. So he decides to go back, and as he marches back, he stops and he throws the gun in the trunk of his car. And as he goes, Dorotha hears the gunshots, gets up to the window, looks out, and sees Bill leaving her house, walking back to to his house. And when Bill gets back to his house, he sees that Faye is passed out drunk. So he picks her up, loads her into her Cadillac down Camelback Road, and sets it to going, and it careens. And there's two witnesses that see it careen down the street where it hits the Arizona Canal. Now, that's not a crime scene photo. That's a Google image when you search old car crashes into canal. In one fell swoop, Bill DeMann has gotten rid of Jim and Faye, and he's now set to live his life however he would like. Now, as you might imagine, there's some problems with this story. Oh, but Bill, first off, the crash happens, the ambulance makes the sound of going to us, and Bill, although he's been drinking quite a bit, he hears the ambulance and he goes over with his camera thinking he'll take some pictures and sell them. And then he notices the car is his wife's car, and then he notices the body is his wife. And he's just staring, he's upset. And Hurley Pruitt, the town marshal, walks over and says, "Bill, can you explain where you were tonight?" And he says, "No, I have no idea. I just have a headache. I have no idea where I was." He said, "Well, that's not good, Bill." He said, "Yeah." And he said, and then another guy walks up and says, "Hey, Bill, what should we do with Faye's body?" And he says, "Oh, just take it to the same place you took Jim's body." And Hurley goes, "Aha! How could you know about Jim? It just happened. You must have done both of them. You're under arrest." And that's how they go into this. So they take it to court, and in the testimony, Dortha's testimony is very bad for Jim. He says that he's very jealous, that he's always jealous of any woman that looked at, or any man that looked at his wife. And they were able, the defense was able to show that it was actually Jim Fredericks who was having affairs, and they called 25 witnesses to testify that they were all having affairs with Jim Fredericks. And the prosecution gave up after 10 witnesses and said, "Okay, enough, 10 is enough. You don't have to parade out all 25. William was not seen leaving the Fredericks house because the defense showed how there was a tree in front of the window, and Dortha could not have seen anything. There was no sun, or there was no light, there's no moon. She may have heard somebody walking, but she did not see anybody. And he didn't implicate himself when asked about where to put Faye's body, because there was two guys who said that they spoke to him before Hurley Pruitt, the marshal, and they told him that Jim had been shot. But they took this to court. For 2 weeks, this was the story. Now, if this happened today, Nancy Grace would have moved a mobile home in front of the Phoenix courthouse and reported daily updates of every motion. But instead, we have 2 weeks of reports, front page above the fold in the Arizona Republic. The first one says testimony starts at 10 o'clock today, and you see right away that they have a little bit of bias. They don't refer to him as the suspect, William DeMann. He's the handsome William DeMann. When they show the picture of Faye, she's the sad-eyed widow. So they definitely show the bias in everything. Dorothy goes on the stand and testifies, and she says at one point, it feels like I'm the one being accused of murder, not Bill. And then the attorney says, but isn't it a fact that your husband is the best-known philanderer in the westmost western town? Now, can you believe they printed that in the Arizona Republic that day? And now here's another question for you, or another thing that I've always wondered. Notice they don't say the only philanderer in the westmost western town. He's the best-known philanderer? What was going on in 1954 in Scottsdale? An amazing thing, they had, as part of the investigation, they gave Bill DeMann truth serum, not once but twice, administered by a doctor. This, of course, would not be admissible in court today, but it happened then. And at the end of all of the testimony, after 90 minutes, the jury comes back and declares him not guilty. And when they do that, there's actually 30 single women in the audience at that time at the courthouse, and they all went, ah. And then there's a story in the next day of how there's 30 women at the Scottsdale photography store trying to get Bill's attention. I guess he sold more film that day than he had in any days previous. But the final day's reporting is what really kind of bothered people. It said he inherited $151,000, which in 1954, that'd be like several million dollars today. And that was the end of the case for this part. But the defense had another theory. And in it had nothing to do with Bill, but it pointed the finger at Dorotha. And then they have their drinks, and they come back, and Dorotha has now figured out that Jim and Faye are having an affair, so she confronts him and says, "You're having an affair with my good friend Faye, and it's going to stop. You're embarrassing me, you're embarrassing Bill. It's just terrible." And he says, "No, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." She says, "Oh, yes, while we were over there, I took Faye's gun, and I can shoot you." And he says, "You wouldn't dare." So she shoots him, and he's dead. Then she marches over. And as she goes there, she takes the weapon, throws it into the trunk of Bill's car to make it look like he did it. And then she finds they're both passed out drunk, so she collects Faye, sets her into the car, the Cadillac, where it careens down Camelback Road, seen by 2 witnesses, before it crashes into the Arizona Canal, where Faye drowns. And then Dorotha would go back home, and she would then call in the shooting of Jim Fredericks. And now she's completely off. That also had some problems and some holes. Dorotha was not considered physically strong enough to move Faye and get her into the car, so maybe she had an accomplice. One of the people noticed that Deputy Robertson of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office was an old friend of Jim's, and seemed to be giving Dorotha a lot of attention after Jim died, so maybe he helped her out. But Deputy Robertson and Dorotha never got together. They married other people, and that really had no implications for them. And Dorotha did marry another man many years later. So there's a third theory that was floated around. And in this, it stars Faye herself. In this one, Faye realizes that Bill has passed out, so she marches over to Jim and says, "We're going to stop having an affair. It's wrong. It's embarrassing all of us, and we're going to stop it right now." And Jim says, "No, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. We're going to keep having this affair." And Faye says, "Oh, yes, I'm from Texas, and we know how to deal with polecats like you." Again, I'm making this up. And she shoots him, and he's dead. And then she marches back, and that's what Dorotha hears going back. But she's so despondent about this that she has ruined her life. So she takes her dog, a German Shepherd, and she and the dog get into the Cadillac, and she tries to drive, but she's been drinking a bit too much during the day, and she ends up crashing into the Arizona Canal, and she and the dog drowned. No, I never mentioned the dog before. The dog was in it all 3 stories, but no one ever mentions the dog until this version. So you're thinking, what? That's kind of a goofy story. I don't know if that really would happen that way. What sort of evidence do you have for that? Well, the Arizona Republic was allowed to go in after the scene was done, the investigation, and they noticed that on Faye's nightstand next to her bed, she had just finished reading a book. And the book was called Dead by Now by Margaret Erskine. And it was a Crime Club selection of the month. And that book outlines the entire story that we just told you, or I just told you, where a woman's having an affair, she kills the man she's having an affair with, she pins it on her husband, and then she takes her own life. But in that one, she plunges a car off the side of a mountain. In this one, she plunges it into the Arizona Canal. I can't tell you which one happened, but after this theory, the case was dropped and no further investigation was done. So who do you think committed this crime? Your guess is as good as mine. We're going to leave Scottsdale in 54. We're going to go up ahead in the future 5 years to one I like to call Drunken Disorderly in Old Town. This is the population of 1959. Scottsdale's been busy annexing, and there's now 10,000 people living in this area. We go as far east as Granite Reef, as far south as McKellips, and it's sort of like a mishmash of annexations. This is the Scottsdale Marshal's office in 1959. I'd like to show you a couple people in this, just so you know. This guy right here, that is the Marshal, Bill Downing. Next to him is the first female police officer in Scottsdale, Lillian Shaheen. Now, when the Scottsdale became a police department in 1963, the chief became badge number 1, and everyone got a badge number based on how early, it's based on seniority, how long you had been working there. And when a badge number is retired, it doesn't come back. So right now we're at 1,600 and something in our badge numbers. But Lillian Shaheen, when she became a part of the Scottsdale Police Office, she was badge number 7. And when she died, her family wrote in her obituary to report the death of Lillian Shaheen, Scottsdale's original 007. I like this guy right here. He's the guy who missed the memo to wear your Stetson hat that day. And the last guy I'd like to point out is the star of this one. He's right there. His name is Ken Pepper. And here's a picture of him about 4 or 5 years later. I found another one. These are not mugshots. These are just pictures I found of him. He's the star of our story today. One day on April 3rd, 1959, Deputy Ken Pepper, who's badge number 3, and Clyde Church get called to Paradise Pharmacy on Pima Plaza. We would call it First Avenue. And Paradise Pharmacy right there, let me circle it for you. And you see where this red car is? That's approximately where the car was parked at that time. We don't know exactly where it was parked because, of course, it's been restriped 100 times in the last 50, 60 years. So they get called and they go to this, that a vehicle is operating, a man is drunk, or he's passed out, or he could be dead, they can't tell, but when they check on this vehicle where this guy appears to be passed out. So they get there and they can smell alcohol right away. They know this guy is drunk. And he's fine, he's conscious, barely, but he's certainly inebriated at the time. And they pull him out of the car, and Clyde Church says, "What are we gonna do with him, Ken?" And Ken Pepper says, "We're gonna arrest him for DUI." And Clyde says, "Do you know who that is?" And Ken says, "Yeah, he's the guy we're gonna arrest for DUI." And he said, No, do you know who that is? He says, "I know, we're still gonna arrest him." And before I tell you who he was, let me go on a little planned tangent. How do you know someone's drunk in 1959? What would their blood alcohol content be? Would you use like field sobriety tests to find out that he's drunk? No, they weren't invented till the 70s. Would you use a breathalyzer? No, that wasn't in popular use till the 90s. If you wanted to do it, you needed the drunkometer. That's the inventor of the drunkometer. He was from the University of Indiana. He was a chemist, and he invented the drunkometer. And what would happen was a police officer would have the person blow into a balloon and be attached to these tubes, and the tubes would go in and some chemical would be added to it, and the shade of blue would show how drunk you were. So he was about 0.205 drunk when this person was applied the drunkometer. And that's how they knew. In 1959, drunk is 0.150. So that's not really that drunk, but to us that would be super extreme DUI. And you had to take the person to jail, not in Scottsdale. We didn't have a jail in 1959. You had to take him to the jail in Tempe. Here's the jail over here. This is the courts, and this appears to be the town hall. If you tried to look for this building today, it would look like this. That's Tempe City Hall, the upside-down pyramid. Now let's find out who our suspect was. Elliott Roosevelt, the son of former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who lived in the area. At different times he had homes in Phoenix, Paradise Valley, and Scottsdale. He was very famous, very well known. He did radio addresses, commercials. He was on game shows. He operated different businesses. He was definitely well known, and a lot of the reason people liked him is he had the same sounding voice as his father. And it just sounded like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this is his defense. He said, first off, I flew to California. I visited my wife who was in the hospital. I flew back, I had lunch with my kids. Then I met dinner with Jack O'Connor. He was my business partner from Grand Junction, Colorado. So you know that when you're having dinner, of course, you're going to have a highball, right? I mean, that's what you do in 1959. Highball, mixed drink, vodka, gin and tonic, rum and coke, whatever the drink was. He had, while he was having dinner with Jack O'Connor, he had highball number 1 and then highball number 2. After dinner, Jack said, hey, why don't we go over to the Cocoa Club in Phoenix because Jerry Lewis is performing. Wouldn't that be cool to go see Jerry Lewis at the Cocoa Club? The Cocoa Club was at 24th Street and Camelback. Today it's the Canby Hotel on the southeast corner. But while they were there, they, just had highball number 3 and highball number 4. But then they weren't done for the night, so they wanted to get some dessert. And where would you go? Well, a great place on the way back is the Mountain Shadows Resort. And you could stop off and have some dessert in the restaurant, and while you're there, you'll have highball number 5 and highball number 6. And then they went home around 2 a.m., and they were discussing their mining operations. And of course, when you're discussing your mining operations, you have highball number 7 and highball number 8. At this point, O'Connor says, hey, I need to go get my car. I left it in Old Town Scottsdale. Can you, let's go drive over and get it. And Elliott Roosevelt told the court that he said, I just don't feel up to driving right now. Why don't we just drive over there, you lock the doors, and we'll come back and get it tomorrow. Okay, so this is his story. He drove over there, and he said that they found it at Pima Plaza. Now, I worked in the downtown area for 5 years with the Scottsdale Police Department. First off, when someone reports their car stolen on Saturday or Sunday morning, the first thing you ask them is, how much did you drink? And they always tell you 2. And then you say, where did you last see it? And wherever they said, you go to the opposite side of Old Town to find it. You never go to the place that they tell you, because you won't find it. It's never where they tell you. But they went to this place in front of Paradise Pharmacy. And here's the part where I don't believe anyone really thought this was accurate. Somehow, Jack O'Connor parks the car, and he goes looking, and Elliott Roosevelt somehow moves from the passenger seat to the driver's seat, starts the car, slumps over. It doesn't sound like it would make a lot of sense to a jury. The jury, not this jury, this is a picture of a jury from 1959. It's actually from a movie, so it's not Elliott Roosevelt's jury. But this jury found him not guilty. So you're thinking, wait a minute, the good guy, the police officer who had integrity, what happened to him? Didn't he lost the case? Well, yeah, he lost his case. But his integrity was considered so good that he was promoted very quickly after this. And when he was promoted, he became, before he was promoted, here's a story about it, and this is the whole accounting of it, of how many drinks he had and where he was with all the drinks. But Ken Pepper got promoted, and when he did, he became Sergeant Pepper and his Lonely Hearts Club Band. Okay, he did become Sergeant Pepper. That's not his Lonely Hearts Club Band. That's actually an earlier picture of the Scottsdale Marshal's office. That's Ken Pepper. And the guy next to him to his right is Red Cooper. He's the marshal who changed the Scottsdale badge from a shield to the 6-pointed star that they still use today. So that's and you see them all wearing the 6-pointed star. So Ken Pepper had a great career after this. He became a sergeant. He became the advisor for what they called the Youth Patrol. A lot of people today, people have actually come up to me after these presentations and said, I knew Ken Pepper. He was my advisor when I was in the Youth Patrol. They've proudly showed me their Youth Patrol badges. So that's the end of the story of Drunken Disorderly in Old Town. And now possibly the most famous murder in Scottsdale history, the unsolved murder of Bob Crane. Scottsdale in 1978 is about 80 square miles. It goes all the way north to Deer Valley Road. And the victim is Bob Crane, a television actor who's born and raised in Connecticut. He married his high school sweetheart, Ann Teresian. They had 3 children, Bobby, Deborah, and Karen. Bob first was a drummer, and apparently he was so good at drumming that I read this in the internet, so this must be true because they can't lie in the internet, that at the beginning of Hogan's Heroes, Bob, you hear the snare drum, dum, 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 dum. Well, you don't want to hear me sing the whole song, but you hear the snare drum at the beginning. They said that's Bob Crane drumming at the beginning of every episode. Whenever he would drum, he was so good at it, he would do other things, but he realized it wasn't a life for a family man, so he decided instead that he would become a disc jockey. And he first was a disc jockey around Connecticut, and then he got eventually hired by KNX CBS in Los Angeles. And he was so good at it as a disc jockey, people would come on the show, and one of the people came on was Carl Reiner, who was the executive producer of the Dick Van Dyke Show. He also played Alan Brady on the show. And when he showed up, they were talking, and he really liked Bob Crane, so he ended up hiring Bob Crane to be in one episode, season 2, episode 14. It's called Someone Has to Play Cleopatra, and it's a really cute episode if you get a chance to watch it on TV Land. But from this one episode, he was then hired on the Donna Reed Show for one season. He was one of the main stars of the Donna Reed Show. And then he got the most unlikely show to become a blockbuster hit in probably the history of television, and that was Hogan's Heroes. This is another little planned tangent. Let's talk a little bit about some of the people in this cast. First one over to the left, Colonel Klink, is played by Werner Klepperer. He's the son of Otto Klepperer. Otto Klepperer had to flee the Nazis in just before World War II, and he came to California. Otto Klepperer was Jewish, but his wife was not. So it's a little ironic that Werner was playing a Nazi in this. But again, it's for acting. John Banner, also Jewish. He was an Austrian Jew, and he was performing in Switzerland when World War II broke out, and he couldn't go back to Austria. So he ended up coming to the United States and becoming an actor. This guy at the bottom, Robert Clary, who played Louis LeBeau, he's the only one still alive. He's 94 years old. And he was a concentration camp survivor. His family was put into Buchenwald, and he was the only one of his family to survive. During the show, if you ever see it's hot and everyone is in short sleeves, he's always wearing long sleeves, so you can't see his concentration camp tattoo. The guy above him is Ivan Kinchlow, or that was his character, Sergeant Kinchlow. Ivan Dixon was his name. And he was the only one to leave the show after 5 seasons. Everyone else stayed for the whole run of the show. His problem was, he said, I had one line in every episode. What are we going to do now, Colonel? He said it wasn't really the acting he was hoping for. Larry Hoovis, he got sort of typecasted as a bumpkin, and he couldn't really get another part after that, so he became a director and producer. And the only person who really became a star after this was this guy who played Corporal Newkirk, and that was Richard Dawson. Richard Dawson introduced Bob Crane to a man who became Bob Crane's best friend. That person was John Henry Carpenter. Carpenter was a salesman of stereo equipment, and he set up Richard Dawson's trailer on the set and his car with brand new stereo equipment. And so Bob Crane hired John Carpenter to put it into his trailer, into his car, and then they became friends and they started traveling around and doing different things. On the night of the homicide, Crane was performing in a play called Beginner's Luck. Now, there was a thing called the Windmill Theater at the time, and every city, or most cities, had a windmill theater, and Bob Crane would travel from city to city for 2, 3, 4 weeks performing Beginner's Luck. He owned the play, he was the director of the play, and it only took 1 or 2 other actors to put it on, so he could move around as if different actors or actresses left, he could just replace them pretty quickly. And on this day of the homicide, he's performing Beginner's Luck, he finishes the play, and he signs autographs for at the end of the play for people who wanted to get his autograph. And then he and John Carpenter, and John was in the audience, leave the Windmill Theater, and they go to Bob's car, and this is a picture of Scottsdale and Shea. This is where the Windmill Theater was. It's now an auction house, if you look for it today. But they find out that Bob's car, someone has vandalized the tires. They've cut the tires, slashed them. So you'd think he might take a cab and go back home, right? No, he says to John Carpenter, get in the car, we'll drive over to the gas station across the street. So they drive on the rims over to the Arco station that's still there today at Scottsdale and Shea, but it's now not a full service, it's a self-serve. When they get there, they have the tires changed, and the mechanic says, someone really slashed these. I'm going to put these tires aside, and I'm going to show the police. So he does. And then they go back to the Safari Resort, and they go to the coffee shop. That was kind of like their hangout at the end of the day. And when they say goodbye, John Carpenter said that although Bob Crane normally took him to the airport, this time Carpenter told him, no, you don't have to take me to the airport. I've got a rental car. Okay. The next day, Victoria Berry has a meeting with Bob Carpenter at noon. She shows up at his apartment. She knocks on the door. Bob, are you there, Bob? The door is ajar, or open, so she opens it up. She goes in. It's all dark. She yells, Bob, are you there, Bob, Bob? She sees in the family room there's a camera set up there. Well, Bob was into cameras and recording, so that wasn't out of the ordinary. And she goes in the bedroom. It's all dark in there, and she sees that Bob Crane has been murdered. There's some sort of like a V-shaped impact in his head, an electrical cord around his neck. This is a picture of Victoria Berry walking out with the Scottsdale police afterwards. Now, many people will say the Scottsdale Police Department botched this case. And there's mistakes made, absolutely. But you need to hear the whole story, how it was a group effort to botch this case, not just to blame the Scottsdale police. First off, an elementary thing in police work is you establish a perimeter, and you don't let anyone go into the perimeter, especially not a witness or a suspect. It's bad. They could take something out, they could put something in, they could change the crime scene. For whatever reason, the sergeant lieutenant in charge this day set up the perimeter, but then had Victoria Berry go back in and answer the phone for them. Don't know why, it was never really explained. And later on, Bobby Crane comes to town with his lawyer, and they give him a tour of the crime scene while it was still a crime scene. And again, this would not be done today. After this, that's when they bring in Detective Borkenhagen, who was their best homicide detective of that time, when the crime scene had already been corrupted, and he was supposed to kind of fix everything. And he tried his best, and we'll talk about some of his investigation in just a minute. The coroner was brought in, and he sees the impact, the V-shape, and for whatever reason, he decides he's going to figure out what made the impact right on the scene, so he starts to cut open Bob Crane's head to find what the object was, corrupting the crime scene. You don't do that at the crime scene. But he did. Then DPS is brought in to be crime scene technicians. They wanted the best, and they photographed everything, and there's no question their photography was outstanding. But they didn't impound all the evidence. So as I said, this was a group effort to mess up this case. In 1978, the county attorney refuses to prosecute. He says, there's no murder weapon. I would need a murder weapon with fingerprints on it to prosecute this case. In 1992, there's a new county attorney, Rick Romley, and he reopens the case. He assigns his own investigator, and the Scottsdale Police Department assigns Barry Vassell, one of its best homicide investigators, to investigate this case. So let's look at the case against John Carpenter. He was with Bob Crane the night before. He was the last person to see Bob Crane alive. Well, that's circumstantial. The night before this, so 48 hours before he was discovered, he had a fight with Bob Crane at Bobby McGee's at Scottsdale and Shea on the northwest corner. And the waitress overheard it and reported to the police, and it went something like, get a life, stop hanging around me all the time, do your own thing. You don't have to keep traveling to all the cities I go to. And apparently Bob Crane had called his son a day before and said, I'm kind of done with John. I'm not going to continue being friends with him. But that's circumstantial evidence. John Carpenter made several suspicious phone calls. He called the Windmill Theater at 3 in the afternoon. Now, John Carpenter traveled with Bob Crane. He knew that Bob Crane never showed up before about 10 or 15 minutes before a presentation because he could just walk in and do it. He had all the lines memorized. But he called and he said, "Hi, this is John Carpenter. I'm in Los Angeles," trying to establish an alibi. "Is Bob there?" "Oh, he's not? Well, will you tell him to call me in Los Angeles? Because that's where I am." It was pretty obvious. He also called up Bobby Crane, the son, and Bobby Crane said when John would call me, he would say things like, "Hey, your dad wants some more film," or "Your dad wants a couple shirts. Will you get it from his closet? Leave it for me, I'll come pick it up." But this day, John Carpenter calls Bobby Crane and says, "Bobby, I just want you to know I'm always here for you." And Bobby says, "Thanks, John." Okay. It was so out of the blue, he reported that to the police. And then he called Bob Crane's apartment, and Victoria Berry answered the phone. And eventually the phone was passed to a sergeant or lieutenant who talked to him and said, "Who are you? Where are you? Where do you live?" And he told him all this, "I'm in Los Angeles, I'm at my house." They hung up the phone, they called LAPD, asked for officers to go over to his house. He wasn't there. He was actually at Richard Dawson's house. Again, this is all circumstantial evidence. So his lying to the police, that's a picture on the left of Richard Dawson's house where he hid out. And on the right, he told the police that he had already made this arrangement with Bob Crane, that Bob didn't have to pick him up and take him to the airport because he had this rental car, but yet he had tapes that were marked with, for John to take home, and he had a pair of John Carpenter's swimming trunks that he left at Bob Carpenter's place. So it was clearly, he wasn't exactly telling the truth, but that is circumstantial evidence. He knew about missing photo albums before the police knew. They said, "What about these photo albums?" They said, "Oh, you mean the 3 photo albums?" He said, "No, there's only 2. "Oh, someone must have stolen one of them," as if he's trying to create another story for why the police should arrest this other person, whoever this other person was. But this is also circumstantial. The murder weapon ended up being a tripod used to hold up the cameras. That's what made the V shape. It had all the right markings and everything in the impact of the cranium. They were never able to find this one. Bob Crane owned 2. They were only able to find 1, so someone must have thrown it away or got rid of it. It was never found. In John Carpenter's car, there was some matter that was believed to be brain matter in the trunk, and they photographed it very well, but unfortunately never impounded it or lost it. There was also blood found on the doors of the rental vehicle, and to get these blood samples and to test them in 1978 technology, they had to destroy much of the door, and they found out it was B blood, type B. Well, 10% of the US population has type B blood. I'm sure you're going to be shocked to find out that Bob Crane had type B blood. But they couldn't use our technology of today to test that blood. So it was inconclusive blood testing. When he was arrested, he called his wife and said, "They finally caught me." Both the police heard him and his wife reported that, but that's circumstantial evidence. So they took him to trial in 1993. The jury seemed to be wanting DNA evidence because they had been watching Law and Order for a couple years now, and they all knew that DNA would probably solve the case. But the police were trying to explain that there was no DNA in 1978, and they didn't know about corrupting the crime scene that much with DNA. So they said people handled things, people didn't always put gloves on back then, it was all corrupted. So they were never able to get the DNA, and there was no real case, so he was found not guilty, and he died a few years later. There was another theory advanced from a moving man who said that he saw somebody else, and although he described John Carpenter leaving the house, he said, no, it wasn't John Carpenter, but that was determined to be not credible. So who do you think did it? There were three main suspects. John Carpenter, Patricia Olson, who went by the stage name of Sigrid Valdez. She was the second wife of Bob Crane, and she was the only person who made money off of this, but it was in a strange way. Bob Crane died in '78. About 10 years later, all the 60s actors sued to get residuals for all the shows that were on being shown from the 60s, and her first residual check was about $9 million. But how would she know that 10 years later, and even though they were in the middle of a divorce at the time, they did not get divorced, and so she got all the money from his residual rights. The other thing would be if there was some other person like the unknown subject seen by the moving man that we just don't know about. Bob Crane's case has been there's been so many books, so many stories, movies. The very first one was called by Robert Graysmith. It was called The Murder of Bob Crane. And that came out before the trial was finished. And from that one, they made a movie called Autofocus. Autofocus is not a documentary. It's one director and writer's interpretation. And they changed the facts significantly. So it's not an accurate portrayal. But if you can find the special edition, there's a documentary with it, and it interviews all the people we were talking about. Detective Borkenhagen got interviewed, Barry Vassell, the attorneys, everybody they could find was interviewed as part of telling this story, and that is the treasure of that movie. Bobby Crane wrote a book called Crane, Sex, Celebrity, and My Father's Unsolved Murder, and John Hook wrote a book in 2017 called Who Killed Bob Crane, and he got all the evidence. It was still in the Maricopa County property and evidence, and he did DNA testing. And if you want to see the results, you can actually go on YouTube and say, Bob Crane DNA results, and you can watch the whole clip. He brought back Barry Vassell, he brought back an attorney who defended John Carpenter, and you can see the whole thing play out. It's kind of interesting. Retired Sergeant Dennis Borkenhagen came to this class the first time I presented it, and he came up to me afterwards and he said I could repeat this. He said, I can't prove it, but John Carpenter murdered Bob Crane. And now we're going to go to the final one of today's presentation called Sleepwalking Through Murder. This happened in 1981. Scottsdale's pretty close to the size we are now, about 180 square miles. And the victim is Alana Singer. She grew up just outside of Chicago, and then she married her high school sweetheart, and she became Alana Steinberg. And then they ended up moving to Scottsdale. And that's a picture of her with her two daughters at a family bat mitzvah. Stephen Steinberg was hired by his father-in-law, Barney Singer, to run a pool company. And Stephen Steinberg was the most unlucky businessman in probably the history of Scottsdale. If he ever had a couple $1,000s of cash, he was a victim of a theft, of a burglary, of an armed robbery. It was terrible. It just happened over and over and over again. And it happened enough that that Barney Singer decided to close the pool company. Well, lucky for him, his brother-in-law was Mitch Singer, and he owned B.B. Singer's restaurants in Scottsdale and in Phoenix. And so he got hired to be a manager of B.B. Singer's restaurants. And the strangest things started happening there, where money kept getting stolen from the restaurants. It was one time, Stephen Steinberg was in Colorado, and he had about $4,000 or $5,000 cash on him. And he said that two large black men, his description was big, bushy hair. I guess he meant an afro. They grabbed him and they threw him into a closet and locked him in there and stole the $5,000. So he reported to the police, and the police essentially called him a liar to his face. That information was never shared with the jury in the Alana Steinberg case. Also, what would happen was oftentimes the cash at the restaurant was kept in a safe. And after Stephen had been working, the next day they would find cash was gone from the safe. They just couldn't figure it out. Of course, Stephen wouldn't do that. On May 27, 1981, Stephen Steinberg called the police to report that two black men with big bushy hair broke into their house and held him down at knife point and had a knife over Alana and said, "Where's your jewelry?" And she said, "No, I'll never tell you." So they stabbed her and said, "Where's your jewelry?" "I'll never tell you." So they stabbed her 26 times. And then they left, and amazingly, they left no footprints. They left nothing. They were just gone. The police came down, they interviewed him, but before they did, he called his neighbors and friends and family over to the house before the police arrived and gave them tours of the crime scene. Now, he was there at B.B. Singer's when Bob Crane's murder happened and afterwards, and he heard the stories of the Scottsdale Police Department not keeping the crime scene, not integrity, so he seemed to be corrupting his own crime scene. And after this, they found out that he owed money for gambling debts, and whenever he owed money, there would be another theft, another burglary, another crime. They also found that the night of the murder, he had gone to B.B. Singer's to see his brother-in-law, Mitch. Mitch wasn't there. He told the staff that he'd go write a note up in his office, and then they found $4,000 missing from the safe the next day. Well, it didn't take very long for Stephen Steinberg to confess that actually he had stabbed his wife 26 times. There were no black men. There was no other people involved. This was a case of a husband murdering his wife. But he hired a very clever attorney named Robert Hirsch. And Robert Hirsch brought in a psychiatrist from California named Martin Blinder. And after interviewing Stephen Steinberg, and they interviewed a lot of the friends, and the friends said that Alana was their description, probably inappropriate by today's standard, a typical Jewish American princess who was always nagging him. And then Martin Blinder, the psychiatrist, said, well, he must have gone into a disassociated state when he killed him. And Robert Hirsch said, well, could you please explain to the jury, what does that mean, a disassociated state? He said, well, in effect, he was sleepwalking when he murdered his wife. And when he woke up, he was completely fine and sane, and everything was fine. Stephen Steinberg was found by the jury not guilty. The case detective said, it's almost like I'm in a disassociative state. How did he get off? That was Frank Hilton, badge 208. Could not believe, this was such a slam dunk case, it could not believe that Stephen Steinberg got away with this. There are 3 jurors who were interviewed for a book called Death of a Jewish American Princess. And forgive me, I'm going to paraphrase them. It's not going to be exact, but the first one essentially said, I can't believe people are surprised by the verdict. This man shouldn't have been up for murder. He should have got a medal, as if a medal for putting up with the nagging he got. The second one said something to the effect of, I think Stephen needs to change his life and take Jesus in. And the third one said, well, I thought he was guilty, but I knew I couldn't convince the other 11. So obviously he didn't know about a hung jury. This was such a travesty that about 6 months after the verdict, the Arizona legislature changed the law so that sleepwalking could never be used again as a defense in Arizona. So that is the end of our presentation for now. Thanks for the golf clap. Thank you. These are some of the people who've helped me with the sources and presentation. These are some of the sources. And at this point, I'd like to thank you all, and thank you all in TV land for watching.